7:30 a.m. Clark woke with his alarm beating on his eardrum and pressed the 5-minute snooze button with delight. For him, those extra 5 minutes were sweeter than they were for most. Clark hated his life. His girlfriend didn't stay around the previous night, which was a good thing. He hated her. The walk in his underwear to his bedroom window was typical. The morning cigarette was the same. He really didn't know why it bothered anymore. Nicotine was just a reminder of the daily pattern, one that had become more deadly than the habit itself. Cancer would be a nice change, he thought, sucking on his cigarette, trying to embrace the infection. He leaned on his windowsill and looked at the room. It mirrored his mind. Shit everywhere. Where to start? His dog had died 3 days ago, and he wished all problems could disappear like that. Go away. Mainly his girlfriend. He had told her she'd become a tumour of his life, and should remain there, like a tumour does. A life-threatening cyst would actually be easier to get rid of, he thought. Today it's going to happen. The party around his later would be the perfect distraction, the perfect alibi. He just had to get work out the way first. "9:02 a.m. So there he was, sat at his desk like he'd never been home. Playing the clock watching game from the moment you step into work means you already lost. Blue was the colour, inside and out. The blue fabric chair, the blue plastic desk, in his light blue shirt and his dark blue tie. Dark blue? I don't help myself, do I? Why didn't I wear red? He whispered. I like red. They want me to wear blue. Feel blue. Already it is tomorrow. They brought this on themselves. Then snap. His pen had broken. The blue pen had been digging into his leg. It brought him back to reality, and the red he wished for came a day early, in blood, seeping through his trouser leg. Clark, is everything okay? Said Gabrielle, the office eye candy. Yeah, I just stabbed myself for the fun of it. Yeah, I'm fine, thanks, he said with a grimace. You sure? She said, leaning on the panel that separated their desks, resting her large breasts on top of it. He admired the way her cleavage accentuated itself, and the way her black bra could be seen so vividly. He was gazing. What did she ask me? Clark, asked Gabrielle, perplexed. Fine, thank you, Gabrielle. Thanks to your tits, he thought with a smile. He turned back to his desk and adjusted his seat to a work position, trying to put the pain in his leg to the back of his brain. A glance at the office clock told him it was 9:14 a.m. He thought if he went to tend to his leg, that would be another 5 minutes gone, and that would be a small victory against the dull-faced blue teaser, the clock. He returned from his trip to the first aid kit and toilet feeling rather good, walking to his desk after a visit to his old friend Procrastination. Refreshed, he took his seat with his brain high on a cocktail of pain and Gabrielle's breasts and readied himself. He stretched out his arms, about to type for the first time that morning, when he saw him staring. Andrews, the boss. How long's he been watching me? Andrews had talked to Clark about his lack of work, and Clark hated him with a passion. Clark stared back, meeting his stare with an intent. He was prepared to be called into the office. The A4 piece of paper in his pocket had enough material on Andrews to make him blush a deep shade of red. All the times he had chatted and wasted valuable company time, as he so often said himself. A trip to the office is what Clark craved. As he stared into the dirty little eyes of a dirty little man, he needed it. His paper would be poetry in that office, provoking emotions. Words like equality and fair play would act like missiles. The irony was, it wouldn't be fair, because Andrews was thick as pig shit, thought Clark. Sure, ignorance is bliss, but when you're wearing an Armani suit, I bet it's fucking heaven. Andrews took off his designer glasses and tucked them into his overpriced shirt and walked towards Clark. Clark raised the fist in his mind, ready for battle. Can I see you in my office, please? Said Andrews, in a managerial tone, a learnt tone that sounded unnatural on men like Clark. A designed tone to emplace power into men that had spent their childhood having no friends and being bullied. Now, accidentally finding authority, they relished and abused it. All the more frustrating because in the natural order of things, I should be higher in the hierarchy. In the wild, I would have bitten your face off a long time ago, thought Clark. Only in this artificial company, this man could hold power over me. And he's wearing a red tie. Thinks he's got it all figured out, doesn't he? Thought Clark, biting the inside of his mouth. 9:22 a.m. This it, thought Clark, discovering how transparent the company was. No window, no desk, more than a surveillance room than an office. The area manager was sitting there, sitting on a small blue plastic chair, looking like a schoolteacher, with a frown plastered upon her face. "Sit down. You know why you're here," said Andrews, taking a seat. "Is it because you haven't turned me into a productive member of the team?" asked Clark, sitting down, crossing his legs, leaning forward slightly. Yes," said Andrews. "Mistake," thought Clark. "Why is that, Mr. Andrews?" asked Clark, raising his eyebrows and stroking his chin. "Wait, that's what I'm here to ask you." "No, Mr. Andrews. The question was, why haven't you turned me into a productive member of the team?" "I don't understand." "Of course you don't, you thick fuck. Is it because you would rather spend your time chatting up Gabrielle, or spend 2 hours on a Tuesday talking about Wednesday's football game? Is this your idea of productivity, Mr. Andrews?" said Clark. He was on the offensive, and he imagined himself as a centurion with a spear in the neck of Andrews, the unenlightened barbarian. "You can't throw around allegations like that. What proof do you have?" blurted Andrews, with eyes heavily on the manager. Beautifully said, thought Clark. Andrews had stepped into his bear trap as Clark fingered the edges of the paper in his pocket. "That brings me to my next point," said Clark, taking out the tightly folded piece of A4 paper from his pocket. He unfolded it and coughed to clear his throat, and began to read, announcing the times Andrews had come in late, chatted by the water fountain, gone home early, with dates and specific times. He went on for a minute until the area manager stopped him. "Mr. Clark, that's more than I need, thank you." "Mr. Andrews," she said, twisting in her seat, "the company has spoken to you before about such subjects. You leave me with little choice. Mr. Clark, you may leave. I need to speak to Mr. Andrews in private." Clark felt like he'd slammed home a winning basket and shattered the backboard. He looked into Andrews' eyes as he opened the door. As he stared back, he could see it started right in his head. Clark hadn't just torn out Andrews' insides. He'd taken what was left, put it in a shredder, and sent him into space. One less at the party tonight, thought Clark. 5:14 p.m. Clark was almost home, but stood outside his flat door was Peter. Clark sighed. Great. Peter was a middle-aged hippie with an elevated opinion of himself. It was the result of spending a year in India living among chimpanzees. The environment had left him feeling superhuman. If Peter's character wasn't interesting enough, he was also a depressive alcoholic whose preachings became enforced lectures after a bottle of red wine. "Hey, Clark," said Peter, throwing the red scarf he wore, regardless of the season, over his shoulder. "Is tonight still happening?" Fuck, he's remembered. "Yeah, 8 o'clock start. You still bringing that paella?" said Clark, trying extra hard to fake authenticity into his smile. "If you want me to," said Peter, with inquisitive eyes. It was undeniable Peter was clever. Too clever. He'd had overeducated demons in his head that when boozed up crawled out of his mind and caused havoc. Peter's a psychopath, thought Clark, staring into his eyes. A week ago, Clark had found Peter's Bible in the corridor, with suggestions in it. Lines crossed out with what God should have said. 3 days before that, Clark had stood at his flat window at night and looked at the city. In the street below, he had watched Peter repeatedly kick a homeless man until he'd stopped moving. "You don't mind me coming to you, Clark," said Peter, looking deeper into Clark's eyes. "I'd rather eat my own testicles." "Peter, of course not. You're more than welcome," said Clark, with something like a smile. 7:14 p.m. Not long before the party, Clark lied in a hot bath. Candles at each corner provided orange light that shimmered on the bath water. This was his time, but it wasn't perfect yet, so he reached for the knife. Slipping it through the still water, he lined the blade up against his forearm and shut his eyes. Feeling the metal slip between the skin, harder again, sliding it downwards. Then it came. Relief. "Yes, you make it all bearable," he whispered, closing his eyes, sliding lower into the water. Smiling in the flickering light, he looked at the blood and fantasized he'd gone the whole way. The water made the blood look more dramatic, more plentiful, more beautiful. After 10 minutes of bathing in the blood, he got out of the bath and looked at what he'd created. The bath water was a light shade of red. He tried to imagine it darker, thicker, purer. One day I'll get there, he thought, reaching for his long-sleeved shirt, putting it on, hiding away the scars on his arm, hiding the real him. 9:22 p.m. I don't believe it. The deluded magnanimous fuck has actually turned up, thought Clark, looking at Andrews through the crowd of bodies. The party was in full swing and people were having fun, drinking, eating, enjoying the music. Andrews stumbled around. He'd obviously had a few drinks before he came and he didn't look like he'd been home. The same work clothes but without the red tie. Andrews wasn't Clark's only headache. His girlfriend Stephanie had been giving him daggers all night. He hadn't bothered to talk to her. He couldn't be bothered. Every time she'd given him an evil, he thought, I really couldn't give a shit about you anymore. Can I see you in the bathroom, Clark? Stephanie said, appearing out of nowhere at Clark's side in the kitchen. Really? Yes, really. He followed her steps through the crowd, a little tipsy, watching the eyes of friends who smiled, knowing he was about to get a telling off. They walked into the bathroom, and it began. What the fuck is going on? Huh? He responded with a smile. You're going to ignore me all night? Look, what the hell do you want? I don't know, maybe a little affection? Said Stephanie. Why the hell would I do that? You're a bitch. Well, this doesn't look good then, does it? No, you're right. It's over. What? She said, panicking. Please don't do this to me, Clark. Please, I'll change. Clark didn't respond. He just looked at her as she fell to the floor sobbing. He knew what she was doing. He'd seen her pull the same act several times this year, and he was bored of it. She was cutting herself with her keys, desperate for affection. Clark didn't care anymore. He walked out the bathroom and decided to leave her there, locking her in behind as he went back to the party. 9:45 p.m. Drunk Andrew sat on Clark's lavish sofa, his expression pissed and slurred. His glazed eyes watched Clark across the room chatting with friends on the opposite sofa. Clark didn't want to meet his gaze. He was a man on the edge, a tequila from making a scene. You bastard, slurred Andrews as he struggled to stand, knocking into the girl beside him, spilling his drink. In an instant, he had everyone's attention as the eyes and ears focused in. You're a petty little shit, Clark. You think that stunt earlier was clever? Get me fired? His words were spaced and sloppy. Clark felt uneasy as everybody was blatantly looking. You think about my kids when you did that? I was just doing my job, you sad little bastard. Jealous, aren't you? You over-educated, pompous prick. The party people laughed and Clark felt terrible. Not because he felt sorry for Andrews, but because he was embarrassed. Andrews gave Clark a stare, and then a jolt gave him his Jack Daniels to the face. A chorus of laughs surrounded Clark, who felt trapped in his own home. Humiliation. The ticking clock of sanity came to a stop, crushed by a small mallet and broken beyond repair. It's time to leave. Insanity started at the feet and rose quickly, hitting the brain within a second, and a quirky smile crawled upon Clark's face. Mr. Andrews, would you care to meet me in the bedroom? Said Clark calmly, placing his drink on the coffee table below. The watching hyenas smiled as they sipped on vodka and orange, blissfully unaware of the terror in Clark's head. Gladly, said Andrews. The second time you slipped up today, thought Clark, smiling even more. But this time will be your last. "9:53 p.m. Pulling down hard on the tie, Clark choked the drunk in his bedroom, contracting his biceps, pulling down with all his weight. Andrews struggled, pushing back Clark into the cupboard behind them. Andrews tried to get hold of the thin red fabric around his neck, trying to alleviate the pain, but the music in the next room created a soundproof prison for Clark to do what he wanted. The loud thuds on the wooden floor couldn't be heard. Using it to his advantage, Clark threw himself down, grabbing onto the fabric and dragging Andrews to the oak floor. Bang! They hit the floor, and Clark reacted quickest, wrapping the tie around Andrews' neck harder. Pulling hard, Andrews' face turned blue, beautifully contrasting against the red tie. Clark's grip did not falter, as muffled sounds of agony leaked from Andrews' purple face. Clark held him tight, listening to the murmurs get quieter and quieter, until Andrews became limp. Then he fell forward on the wooden floor, and Clark relaxed. Clark looked at him and smiled as he released his grip. He stood up and pulled dead Andrews up and dragged him into his bed. Pulling the sheets over his head, Clark headed back to the door. Back to the party, thought Clark. 10:06 p.m. "Everything okay?" asked Angela, the middle-aged ball of a secretary, the instant he stepped outside his bedroom door. "Fine, thanks, Angela. Just fine," Clark responded with the identical fake smile to hers. "Really? You didn't hear okay? I thought I heard noises." "Like I said, Angela, it's fine. He's just having a little too much to drink and he's having a little sleep now. Is that okay with you?" said Clark, with his face looking more serious than ever before. "Yes, fine. I didn't mean to." "Well, I suggest you shut the fuck up and keep yourself to yourself. Enjoy the rest of the party." Angela stood there in total shock. Clark grinned as he walked away. He'd given her a glimpse into the new window of his new sanity. He then walked past the people in his house, as if they weren't there, to his open-style kitchen and dished himself some paella. That's when Peter walked up beside him. "I hope the paella's just fine," said Peter, stood with a glass of red wine, with the red scarf and red cheeks that suggested he'd had a drink too many. Clark could feel a lecture about life was coming, so he took the initiative. "Peter," said Clark, turning towards him with his new philosophy, also known as insanity, "are you aware you're a depressed alcoholic with an elevated opinion of oneself? To shield yourself from the truth about your failure to marry the woman and raise a family? Are you aware the fact you're fighting to do so is giving you a warped belief that you're better than the rest of society, and this is the very reason you're depressed?" Peter responded with a reflex smile that quickly disappeared. Clark stared into Peter's blue eyes that seemed to turn red, but Clark was angry too, fed up with 7 months of meaningful chats that just translated as, "You're a piece of shit, Clark." He'd had enough. As Peter stepped forward with a heavy stank of alcohol and anger, Clark reached for the wine bottle on the kitchen side. Without warning, he slung it with all his force across Peter's face. The impact on Peter's skull sent him colliding into the kitchen top side. As he fell into the shattered glass, he dragged down Paella with him. Clark didn't waste time. He began stamping hard on his head, with the sole of his boot to the face, followed by the razor-sharp broken wine bottle. "This is what you get for that homeless guy, you fucking freak!" The screaming came from the party people with the blood. No one dared get near the maniac that smashed broken glass into Peter's face. Most of the wine bottle was in shards, in and around Peter's head, and Clark showed no concern for his hands that were getting cut as he relentlessly smashed bloody fists into his face. People threw their glasses and ran to the closest exit. Peter had stopped moving for nearly a minute, but the punching hadn't. When it did, Clark looked at the face of a man whom he no longer recognised. It was all shades of red and interesting textures. Clark hadn't noticed the people had gone as he got up and poured himself another glass of red wine. He walked to his stereo and turned up the music. It played his favourite piece by Beethoven, the Fur Elise. He listened to the piano as he walked across his living room. Spilt drinks were everywhere, and the coffee table was on its side. He looked at himself in the large mirror on the wall. "I'm a bloody mess," thought Clark. He smiled again and he headed towards the bathroom. 10:27 p.m. Clark unlocked the bathroom door. Stepping inside, he smiled at Stephanie and closed the door behind him, locking it. Even though Clark was covered in blood, and she had heard the screaming outside, she remained silent. Standing up from sitting on the bath, she asked innocently, "Clark, what's happened to you?" Standing there, with a wide smile, he reached for the knife he'd been cutting himself with earlier, taking it from beside the tap. Stephanie's eyes grew and her face twitched. "Clark, you don't need to. We can—" Then it happened. He didn't even notice, but it was there. His hand on the black plastic with a blade that was through her neck. She didn't try to speak. With the blade through her windpipe she couldn't. But she didn't need to. Her brown eyes said everything. Why? She thought. With a kick to the stomach, he sent her stumbling back, forcing the knife he'd held onto to rip through her throat, leaving blood and skin on the bathroom floor. She fell into the bathtub, hitting her head hard on the marble wall. More blood, thought Clark with a lick of his lips. With insanity in its most violent form, Clark stood over her, inspecting her like a butcher. Where to start? With his fantasy about to be fulfilled, he leaned over her body and put in the plug. He watched her chest tremor as her eyes watered innocently. She couldn't speak. She tried to let her eyes do the talking, but it was hopeless. The man she once loved was gone, and he grabbed the knife with both hands. He raised it high and plunged it into her chest with a cry of pleasure. Getting in the bath with her. Her brown eyes screamed as they moved frantically, watching the blade slash in all directions. The bath filled with blood the more frenzied his attack became. Then suddenly, stop. It's time, he thought, gasping for air in his girlfriend's blood, watching something float past his leg. Perhaps that's her heart, thought Clark. While standing up, a thick splash of blood spluttered. He looked down into the dead eyes with relief. She's gone. Red was the colour. The red pool of blood on the bathroom floor, the drenched red clothes they wore, the now red towel on the bathroom floor. It appeared red wasn't the colour of anger, but the end. Red had rescued him. It was the end of his blue days. Stepping out the bath in the comforting warmth of blood, he walked to the end of the bathtub and grabbed her dead feet. He dragged out the corpse, trying not to spill too much of the blood. Thud, it went on the bathroom floor. Dragging her aside, leaving her next to the toilet. He undressed, and as he got naked, he looked at the blood-filled bath and smiled. Stepping in, he lowered himself gently and began to wash in all the red. Red is what I needed all this time. The colour of romance, the colour of anger and aggression, the colour of passion. Red is my saviour. He smiled and let out a last laugh of joy. But then it came, the inevitable Blue, into his bathroom to take him away. He tried to fight, but Blue is always there and always wins against men like Clark, the unstable and the insane. And Blue, it may end one day for you.